All right, my English teacher friends. So I bring to you in this video another one of my alternative grading methods, and I entitled this one Pooh Sticks. So at the time of recording, it's a Monday morning. And if you spent your weekend completely immersed in the task of grading, then I think this is a perfect video for you. There's a couple of things I don't like about traditional grading methods that I'll discuss in greater detail in this video. But suffice it to say now, at this stage of the video, that when 99.9% of the onus is placed on the teacher's shoulders, it precludes learning from happening. So if you think about the traditional grading paradigm, above and beyond reading our comments, what are we really tasking our students to do? And we know full well that a lot of our students don't even read our comments. They look at the grade and they say, yeah, I love Mr. Kuhn. He gave me a 98. Or, oh, I hate Mr. Kuhn. He gave me a 72. They internalize it very personally on those levels. And what we need to do is really shift that onus so that the students are doing the heavy lifting in order for them to grow and mature as writers. Because I know full well that I could put an ocean of red ink on every single one of my students' drafts from September until they leave me at the end of June, and they will not grow or mature as a writer as the result of all that heavy lifting and as the result of me giving up my evenings and weekends to facilitate their growth as writers. It just doesn't work. It's a pipe dream. It doesn't work. So in this particular video, I'm going to show you my Pooh Sticks version of an alternative grading method, and we're going to focus on a synthesis essay that I did with my AP Lang kids that centers around MTV's parental control. So I'll show you how I would grade them, I'll show you the assignment, and I'll show you the alternative grading method all in one fell swoop. So these are the guidelines to set up the Pooh Sticks activity. So you split the class into 3 teams. So there's 3 people on the bridge for Pooh Sticks, and I'll show you that PowerPoint in just a second, the actual game. So you have a red, a yellow, and a blue team, and you just split the class into 3 teams. And then the game, as again, I'll show you in just a second, the stick order as it comes out from underneath the bridge determines the order of critique. So let's say the red stick comes out first from the bridge, then the red team will go first, then the blue, then the yellow. Each team has to contribute 2 things to the paper. So each student will submit their draft to the class for full class review. It could be anonymous. Usually I have my kids announce themselves, and we just have at their paper, and you can do it any way you want. So I'll show you a way that I did it, where we just did this for introductory paragraphs to make sure that the thesis was intact, that out of the gate kids who came out with blazing speed and were off to a good start. So you don't have to do the whole paper, but this is a great way to peer edit. So each team contributes 2 things with regards to the draft. So anything good, bad, ugly, 2 things they're going to comment on. So in the end, the person whose draft is up there for review gets 6 concrete suggestions from their peers, and then anything that's missed, I'll chime in and bring it to the forefront. I do have a speaking quota. I tell students that once you've spoken twice, you cannot speak again until everybody in your team has spoken at least once. I really like this rule because some students, as you know, just tend to be wallpaper and blend in, and they don't contribute. So it's a really nice way to get everybody to contribute. You can do point value systems if you want to, and how I do that is at the end of the review, the person whose paper is being reviewed can ascribe points to the team that gave that particular student the best advice, and then you have a little prize. So usually I do like a couple boxes of fruit and grain bars or something like that, or a big tub of jelly beans or something of that nature, or a blow pop for the team that wins. but you don't necessarily need to do that. And then at the end of the review, the student, with all the peers and the teacher involved, sets 3 learning targets for that draft. So 3 things that the student concretely can do to improve that draft or the next subsequent essay. So here's the thing that you're going to see here as I go over this. The glory of having a shared language. My students, I equip them with my templates of the declarative and the inverted thesis, as well as the syllogistic method for the body paragraphs, but they also run through my nuance and word study academy. From day one, I get them the day after Labor Day until, the late teens of June. All year long, we're talking the same language. So therefore, we have a very focused concentration when we look at writing. My students have my language and I know their language. So we're all communicating at the same level, which is really nice. And the only way you have that occur is if you run nuance academies, word study academies, and equip your kids with templates. Otherwise, it's just all ethereal pie in the sky kind of stuff. They won't know your language. So I'll give you an overview of my assignment, and then I'll show you how I graded these essays with the alternative grading method. So this one I called the Psychology of Teenage Dating synthesis paper. So in terms of the prompt, this is what we were looking at. It says, given that you now know a bit of the psychology and sociology behind the scenes of teen dating, here's what you need to do. Give dating advice in the form of a letter to one of the principal characters from MTV's Parental Control. Position yourself as a therapist or counselor or BFF. Give your subject an inside look into the clockwork of their inner psyches and get them on the right path. Draw evidence from at least 3 sources. So it's just straight up quintessential synthesis paper. High engagement though. My students love this assignment. And here's the setup for it. Students for homework needed to watch any 2 episodes they wanted of MTV's Parental Control. They're free on YouTube, but the streaming networks have them in abundance. So any 2 episodes. They needed to participate in a Plato's Plato discussion, where we brought forth some episodes. I had a packet that I developed for them of 7 articles that gets into the psychology and sociology of teenage dating. They needed to read and annotate the source packet. We made quote walls and things of that nature, and that's kind of the general setup of it without belaboring it too much. So I did an exercise with them where I asked the question, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And my students know for synthesis, you can declare or invert. It's a 50-50 flip. So if you declare, you begin with the thesis. So you would give the character the advice right out of the gate. Just boom, drop it as declaratively as possible. Sprinkle in a little bit of context and background, but word of caution, don't get into the sources. Don't regurgitate any sources. Don't quote anybody. It's just 100% nuts and bolts thesis. Your argument must be central. Tier 2 level vocabulary, it is kind of a quasi sociology, psychology synthesis paper. So by tier 2, I just simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. It's an academic pursuit, so keep it academic in the diction. Sentence constructs, I alluded to my Nuance Academy already. So I am a big fan of Strunk and White's text called Write It Right. And in it, they have a concept called Rule Number 18. And they espouse the idea that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So in order to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow, my students work on that tier 2, but they also can manipulate their syntax quite nicely in order to get that flow, to break away from stacking independent clause, something. It's a trait that struggling and emerging writers have. They overuse the short, simple declarative sentence, which has this droning rhythm. And then it's going to be exactly 4 sentences long. So that's the declarative. The inverted, you just flip it. Student might start with hook, analogy, context, background, sprinkle in the tier 2, focus on those sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences long. So what I do is I always Bob Ross it for my students. And what I mean by that is I position myself as the expert writer in the classroom. and I paint introductions for my students and with my students. I do it live, but I also pre-write them before they come in just to save time, because sometimes it's hard to do these Johnny on the spot. So they follow my lead. So I, in doing this, discovered that what is best, otherwise it's very brusque and abrupt. If you declare the thesis, it kind of sounds hostile in a way, aggressive if you declare the thesis. All of mine I inverted. So students were like, oh, okay, cool, I'll invert. So this is one of mine that I wrote. Dear Anthony, right? Because we're writing a letter. Teenage dating is a bit like the phenomena of being presented with a massive menu at a fancy restaurant. Most people would select a dish that they are familiar with instead of going out on a limb to try something new. So I tried the hook, the analogy. An unconscious mental model of attachment is at play here. And believe it or not, the same type of consideration comes into play when we choose our significant others. Whether we grew up with ideal parents like June and Ward Cleaver or within the walls of sheer dysfunction, we tend to date what we know. Given this, I choose a partner who's very different in every aspect of life from your mother. So my advice comes right here, last sentence. So it's inverted. 4 sentences. Sentence constructs are pretty sweet. I'm doing all sorts of little tricks here with my syntax. Vocab is up without sounding overly goonish. So let me show you the PowerPoint game that we would use to critique this, and then I'll show you the other samples that students wrote. So it's called Pooh Sticks, and this comes from a fantastic graphic designer. He's got a website called powerpointgames.uk, and he's got a slew of these. So let me show you how Pooh Sticks works. So I would present that introduction to class and split the class into 3 teams. Drop the Pooh sticks, and whatever comes first, that team's going to contribute feedback first. So yellow goes first, blue, then red. So that's the order. So that's just simply how you play Pooh sticks. So in terms of how to get students to critique this, I would break down mine and tell them the good, the bad, the ugly of it. This one I pegged, right? I wrote it intentionally well. It's perfectly executed. It's exactly what an inverted thesis is supposed to do. I would Bob Ross another one just to really shore up how to do it. So this one's mine. It's going to be inverted yet again. Dear Jimmy, it is very common for some teenagers to experience the opossum effect when it comes to their early dating years. In this stage of development, teens have very passive identities and are, more or less, people pleasers and seldom assert their wills. Teens that get stuck in this state of moratorium usually become doormats in relationships, unless they couple with a like-minded individual. With this in mind, I highly suggest you date Katrina, given her temperament and inclinations. So my advice comes next. So one of the things that we talked about, if you're going to run this assignment, is you have to stay anchored in the theory, in the psychology and the sociology to give it that clinical perspective, right? Because you're given advice to these teenagers, and you're not BFFs with them. You're not giving casual lunch talk, locker room talk kind of advice to this person. You're giving them good clinical advice because you are an expert in sociology and psychology at this stage of the game. So these are some student drafts, and I'll show you what happens. Students see mine, and I wrote 4 of them just to give them a sense of how to do it. And then students put theirs up, and based on my samples, you begin to see kind of a drop off and sort of like student tendency with this. So look at this. Dear Olga, have you ever driven to the store and had to choose between some nice barbecue chips or some new chips that you've never tried before? Online dating is a lot similar to that in many discrete aspects. Teens tend to date and go on relationships with people who have similar characteristics to our parents. Adolescents do not realize that this hidden mental mode that's playing before our very eyes. We see the similarity with Chris and Jesse, in which Olga chooses between them, despite how different they are. So here's what my students picked up on with this. One is students noted that, starting with a rhetorical question is probably not the most skillful thing to do. I tend to avoid that in writing. I don't like it when students ask a question of a question. It's just, I don't know, not very skillful. So they noted that beginning with the rhetorical question was probably not the best way to begin. And then this analogy is also kind of awkward. So in my model, I was talking about a Chinese menu, and this kid said, "Oh, barbecue chips, potato chips," and it doesn't really work all that well. So what's the correlation between, selecting a comfort snack versus online dating or teenage dating? And then the big thing down here is they didn't give any advice to a principal character. They didn't even meet the demands of the assignment and follow the prompt. But they do have all the theory and technique that they are going to need that's required of them. So it's basically that first sentence and last sentence needs to be tweaked. Here's the cool thing about playing Pooh sticks. Students can bring that to students. I don't need to have exclusive lord dominion over the composition in order to bring the students' attention to that. I don't need all that power. I don't need all that authority. Give it to students because they are familiar with the language of the template. They're able to talk that way. So they were able to say things like, with this one, the sentence structures are very good. The syntactical flair is very nice in this. The vocab is nice. It's just those first that first sentence and the fourth sentence that need to be shifted. Make sure you got a thesis down below where you're specifically addressing Olga, right? Because you're addressing the letter to Olga. Give the advice to Olga. There's no advice right here. There's no thesis. And then probably tweak that analogy and get rid of the rhetorical question. Very cool. And students can do that. I don't need to do that heavy lifting, 99.9% of the onus on me. Give it to the students and they can help each other out. Very, very cool. So here's one last one. Good morning, Lisa. Most parents deem parallel play to be an important facet in the development of their young child, hence all the play dates in early childhood. As to no surprise, some kids do better in these social situations than others, and believe it or not, these tendencies follow individuals well into their teen and adult years. For some, this is simply a crisis of intimacy versus isolation. Given how egocentric and narcissistic you are, I strongly advise you not to date until you come to terms with these personal issues. 4 sentences, sentence constructs, tier 2, right? My students could talk about this all day long. Get the theory in there, invert the thesis. So here's the other thing in doing this. When we adhere to the traditional grading paradigm, the only one who's seeing student work is the teacher, right? I am a big contender of this, big believer of this. The more writing a student sees, the better they become as writers. Students need to see a lot of writing in order to become better writers. So in my AP Lane class, we're a class at 22. My students saw 22 introductions. They had a good, clear sense at the end of this activity, the good, the bad, the ugly about their draft, and they were able to revise it. And then in terms of full disclosure, I'm on a block schedule. And in order to get through the introductions, we took a block and then we had to go into one extra class. We spent about 15 minutes of another class just doing the introductions because this was the first time that we really used some theory and technique with the psychology and sociology in a thesis, that it was a little tricky, and I wanted to make sure that before they plowed into the rest of their essay, that they were good in the hood as far as having a good thesis statement. So a couple things to keep in mind. Note that on March 11th, 2023, it's a Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'm going to be running an alternative grading method 2-hour intensive with the National Writing Project. So if you want more information on that, you can go to teachinghowtowrite.com. So in 2 hours, we're going to go over 20 plus alternative grading methods just like this one. If you have questions about anything, feel free to reach out at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. National Writing Project and I offer PD throughout the year, and I run that alternative grading methods probably 3 times during the calendar year, but the next one is March 11th. So check out my webpage, teachinghowtowrite.com, for all the PD offerings that I'll be doing with the National Writing Project. We're very busy, got many irons in the fire, and are always doing something really good. So be well for now. Happy teaching, happy writing.